The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It fell in a grey, unbroken sheet over the shattered fields of Flanders, turning roads into rivers and trenches into graves. The air stank of mud and metal, cordite and decay. Amid that ruin, 2 figures moved through the storm, cloaked in heavy coats, faces streaked with soot and blood. Elsie Knocker wiped her hands on her apron, her fingers trembling from the cold and exhaustion. The small field post they'd built, little more than a broken farmhouse held together by willpower and sandbags, was overflowing again. Men groaned from every corner, some begging for morphine, others praying for their mothers, some silent forever. "Hold the light steady, Mary," Elsie muttered. Mary Chisholm did as told, her face pale but her eyes fierce beneath her helmet. She was younger, just 20, but already carried herself like someone who had lived 3 lifetimes. Together, they worked with a rhythm that had become instinct: cut, bind, pour, sew, breathe. Outside, the shells thundered again, a dull, endless percussion that shook the very walls. Shards of plaster fell from the ceiling, sprinkling onto the wounded soldier laid out before them. He was little more than a boy. His chest was torn open, his skin grey, his heartbeat fluttering under Elsie's hand. She whispered, half to herself, half to God, "Stay with me, lad, just a little longer." Mary fetched another bandage, her boots squelching in the mud on the floor. "We can't keep them all alive, Elsie," she said quietly. "We're out of plasma, and the supply truck's not coming back tonight." Elsie's jaw tightened. "Then we use what we have." She leaned closer to the boy. "What's your name, soldier?" The boy's lips moved faintly. "Thomas. Thomas Hensley. London." "All right, Thomas," Elsie said softly, voice trembling but steady. "You'll be home soon." Her hands worked faster, the practiced motions of someone who refused to accept futility. But deep down, she knew. The pulse faded beneath her touch, the body going limp, the eyes losing focus. Mary saw the look on her face and lowered the lantern. "He's gone, isn't he?" Elsie didn't answer. She reached up and closed his eyes with 2 fingers, then whispered, "Another one for the fields." The thunder outside swallowed her words. They stepped out moments later, the icy wind slashing across their faces. The night was a landscape of flame and shadow, the horizon flickering with artillery flashes, the air alive with the low moan of the dying. "This madness," Mary said under her breath. "What are we even doing here?" Elsie stared into the distance, toward the faint silhouettes of men hauling stretchers through the mire. "Because if we don't," she said, "no one will." A shell whistled somewhere far off, then exploded to their right, a plume of fire and debris lighting the night sky. They ducked instinctively. When the smoke cleared, the field was quieter, except for the groans of a few new voices in the dark. Elsie glanced at Mary. "Come on. They'll need us again." And so they walked into the storm once more. By dawn, the shelling had eased, leaving behind a landscape that no longer resembled the world. The trees were blackened skeletons, the earth torn open, and in every hollow lay the remnants of men and memory. Elsie and Mary stumbled back into their post, a place that smelled of blood and burning fuel. Their hands were stiff, their faces smudged with soot. Neither had slept in 2 days. "Tea?" Mary asked, her voice hoarse. Elsie gave a dry laugh. "If there's any left that doesn't taste of smoke." Mary found a dented tin mug and poured the last of their tepid water into it, heating it over a small blue flame. It wasn't tea, not really, but they drank it anyway, the ritual of normalcy stronger than the taste. "Do you ever think about home?" Mary asked quietly. Elsie paused, her eyes distant. "Home feels like another life. Before all this. Before the mud, the screams, the men who never come back." Elsie looked at her with something between pity and admiration. "You're too young to be this old." "I've seen enough to last a century," Mary replied. They sat in silence, listening to the faint wind whistle through the cracks of the ruined farmhouse. Then came a faint sound, muffled shouts in the distance. "Stretchers," Elsie said, standing. She grabbed her coat and moved toward the door. Outside, 2 soldiers were dragging a makeshift stretcher through the mud,
carrying a man whose leg was barely attached. His face was ashen, his breath shallow. "Set him down here," Elsie ordered, clearing a space on the floor. They obeyed without question. She knelt beside him, cutting away the uniform with a surgeon's speed. Blood poured freely. She pressed her hands against the wound, feeling the life slip through her fingers. "Where are you hit, lad?" she asked. He groaned, eyes glassy. "It's bad, miss. I can't feel it, my leg." "You won't if I have anything to say about it," she said, voice firm. "Mairi, I need a clamp, now." Mairi handed her the instrument, and together they worked as shells began to rumble again in the distance. The world outside was chaos, but inside, the two women moved with precision, one heart, one purpose. The man screamed once, then passed out. Elsie tightened the bandage and whispered, "You'll live. I promise." When she looked up, Mairi was watching her. "You always say that," Mairi said softly. Elsie gave a faint smile. "Because sometimes they do." She stood, wiping her hands on her apron again. Her back ached, her knees throbbed, but there was no time to rest. Outside, another call echoed through the smoke. "Medic. Over here." Mairi grabbed her kit. "They'll never stop coming." Elsie looked back at the wounded man on the floor, his breathing faint but steady, and said, "Then neither will we." They stepped out into the morning light, where the rain had finally stopped. But the sky was still grey, and the earth still red. A British officer approached, his face drawn, his uniform immaculate despite the filth around him. "You're too close to the front line," he said sharply. "Orders from command, you're to fall back to the reserve post." Elsie's eyes hardened. "If we fall back, those men out there die before they even reach us." "That's not your concern." "It's exactly my concern," she snapped. The officer hesitated, unused to defiance. "You're civilians. You shouldn't even be here." Elsie stepped closer, her voice steady and cold. "Tell your generals that if they want someone to save their sons, they'd best let us stay." For a moment, the man stared at her, then nodded, silently turning away. Mairi watched him go, half amused. "You really do have a way with words." Elsie adjusted her gloves. "Words won't stop the bleeding. Come on." And once again, the angels of no man's land went where few dared to follow. The day bled into another night, and the night into another endless dawn. Time, for Elsie and Mairi, no longer moved in hours or days but in the intervals between cries for help. They became known to the soldiers simply as the angels. Not because they looked divine, their uniforms were permanently stained with blood and mud, their faces lined with exhaustion, but because when a man lay dying in the dirt, it was their hands that reached out of the smoke to pull him back. Word spread through the ranks, "If you're hit near Pervyse, find the angels. They'll get you home." By the third week, the war had moved closer than ever. German artillery had begun shelling the outskirts of the town, and the sky burned red every night. The farmhouse they had turned into a hospital now shook with every impact, the windows cracked, the roof sagging. Still, they refused to leave. "Elsie, this roof won't hold another hit," Mairi warned, her voice sharp as the next shell screamed overhead. Elsie looked up briefly, then continued dressing a soldier's wound. "Then we'll hold it ourselves." A distant explosion made the floor tremble. A few of the wounded men cried out, clutching their stretchers. Mairi knelt beside one of them, a boy with freckles and shaking hands. He looked no older than 16. "Easy now, love," she whispered. "You're safe here." He stared at her, eyes wide. "Are you angels? Someone said you were." Mairi smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "If we are, we're the dirtiest ones heaven's ever seen." The boy tried to laugh, but the sound broke into a cough. Blood spotted his lips. Outside, they heard shouting, a warning from one of the nearby troops. "Gas! Gas incoming!" The day bled into another night, and the night into another endless dawn. Time, for Elsie and Mairi, no longer moved in hours or days but in the intervals between cries for help. They became known to the soldiers simply as the Angels. Not because they looked divine, their uniforms were permanently stained with blood and mud, their faces lined with exhaustion, but because when a man lay dying in the dirt, it was their hands that reached out of the smoke to pull him back. Word spread through the ranks, if you're hit near Pervyse, find the Angels. They'll get you home. By the third week, the war had moved closer than ever. German artillery had begun shelling the outskirts of the town, and the sky burned red every night. The farmhouse they had turned into a hospital now shook with every impact, the windows cracked, the roof sagging. Still, they refused to leave. "Elsie, this roof won't hold another hit," Mairi warned, her voice sharp as the next shell screamed overhead. Elsie looked up briefly, then continued dressing a soldier's wound. "Then we'll hold it ourselves." A distant explosion made the floor tremble. A few of the wounded men cried out, clutching their stretchers. Mairi knelt beside one of them, a boy with freckles and shaking hands. He looked no older than 16. "Easy now, love," she whispered. "You're safe here." He stared at her, eyes wide. "Are you angels? Someone said you were." Mairi smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "If we are, we're the dirtiest ones heaven's ever seen." The boy tried to laugh, but the sound broke into a cough. Blood spotted his lips. Outside, they heard shouting, a warning from one of the nearby troops. "Gas! Gas incoming!" Elsie froze, then lunged for her mask. "Get them covered," she yelled. Mairi ran from bed to bed, helping those too weak to move, pulling masks onto trembling faces. The hiss of gas shells filled the air, followed by the acrid sting that burned the lungs and eyes. Within seconds, the room was a haze of yellow-green mist. Elsie's mask fogged with every breath, but she kept moving. One man's mask had torn, another couldn't breathe properly. She tore her own sleeve and tied it over his mouth. Her eyes stung, her throat seared, but she wouldn't stop. Mairi stumbled through the haze, coughing violently, her hands searching blindly for the next patient. When at last the gas cleared, the world was silent again, too silent. The air stank of chlorine and despair. Mairi leaned against the wall, pulling off her mask and gasping for air. Her eyes watered, her face pale. "Elsie, we can't keep doing this." Elsie looked around at the men, the living, the dying, the broken. She thought of the fields back home, of the quiet lanes of Hampshire, of her son. Then she looked back at Mairi. "For as long as they need us." Mairi didn't argue. She just nodded, tears streaking her soot-stained cheeks. Elsie looked around at the men, the living, the dying, the broken. She thought of the fields back home, of the quiet lanes of Hampshire, of her son. Then she looked back at Mairi. "For as long as they need us." Mairi didn't argue. She just nodded, tears streaking her soot-stained cheeks. Outside, the first rays of morning sun broke through the smoke, touching the ruins of the farmhouse and the faces of the wounded. For one fleeting moment, it looked almost peaceful. But somewhere beyond the horizon, the guns began again. And Elsie Knocker and Mairi Chisholm, two women who had defied orders, fear, and the very boundaries of war, lifted their kits, adjusted their helmets, and walked back into the noise. By the time dawn came, the field around Elsie and Mairi looked like another world, a world made of ghosts and echoes. The mist clung to the earth, soft and grey, hiding the scars of the night. Every few minutes, the silence was broken by the distant groan of guns, or the soft cry of a man waking to pain. Inside their makeshift post, an old, crumbling house just behind the line, they worked without rest. The walls were cracked and blackened by shellfire. The windows were gone, replaced by torn blankets. And yet, in that ruin, life persisted. "Hold the lamp higher," Elsie said. Her hands were deep in bandages, her sleeves soaked with blood. The soldier on the table gritted his teeth as she cleaned the wound. "You're doing fine, love. Just breathe." The man's voice was weak. "Why are you here, miss? This isn't a place for women," she finished for him, her tone sharp but kind. "Someone has to pick up the pieces you boys leave behind." Mairi chuckled from the corner, where she was boiling water over a small flame. She says that to everyone, she muttered. Elsie shot her a look, but a smile flickered on her tired face. Because it's true. That small exchange was enough to cut through the gloom. Even in war, laughter was rebellion. Outside, the wounded kept coming. Word had spread, 2 women running a first aid post near the line, where others feared to go. They called them the Angels of Pervyse. Some soldiers said the angels were real. Others said they were mad. But everyone came to them when the shells fell. One afternoon, as the thunder rolled closer, Mairi stepped outside for air. She looked across the empty field, toward the trenches, a landscape torn by fire and history. The sky was a flat sheet of grey, the wind cold and sharp. She could see the flashes in the distance, bright veins of light cutting through the fog. She thought of home, of Scotland, the green hills, the laughter of her family. She thought of what she might have been if the world hadn't gone mad. Elsie came out a moment later, her coat stained but her eyes alive. "You should rest," she said. "I can't," Mairi replied. "If I close my eyes, I still hear them." Elsie nodded slowly. "Then we'll listen together." And so they did, 2 women standing in the ruins of Belgium, listening to the faraway cries of men they refused to abandon. That night, the sky came down. A German shell landed just outside their post, shattering the door and blowing in half the wall. The air filled with dust and screams. Mairi hit the ground hard, ears ringing, lungs burning. "Elsie," she shouted. "I'm here," came the reply, muffled, but strong. When the dust cleared, Elsie was already crawling through the rubble, searching for the wounded. A young soldier lay half buried under the debris, blood trickling down his face. "Help me lift him," she cried. Mairi grabbed the other side, her hands shaking. Together they pulled the man free and dragged him into what was left of the house. The roof was half gone now, open to the night sky. Rain began to fall, washing the blood into the dirt. Elsie knelt beside the soldier, pressing a cloth to his chest. "Stay with me," she whispered. "You'll see the morning." He blinked up at her. "Are you an angel?" She smiled faintly, tears mixing with the rain. "No, love," she said. "Just someone too stubborn to leave." Days turned into weeks. Their hands never stopped moving. They patched wounds, carried bodies, wrote letters home for men who couldn't hold a pen. When the food ran out, they shared what little they had. When the morphine ran dry, they comforted with words instead. They were not soldiers, but they fought every day, fought death, despair, exhaustion. And in that constant battle, they became something more than nurses. They became a symbol. One British officer later wrote, "Where the guns fell silent for a breath, you could hear their voices. Calm. Steady. Unafraid. Like angels walking through the mud." When the war finally moved on, the ruins of Pervyse were left behind. But in that shattered town, 2 women had written their own kind of victory, one not measured in territory or medals, but in lives saved, in the humanity they refused to surrender. Years later, when people asked Elsie Knocker why she stayed so long at the front, she said simply, "Because someone had to. And I was there." And when they asked Mairi Chisholm if she ever regretted it, she smiled softly and said, "No. We walked through hell, and we found a bit of heaven in it."